Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew was no longer the man Willow once believed in. The shattering of her world, marked by the brutal court ruling that stripped her of custody over Wiley and Amelia, had barely settled when Drew moved in with a precision that could only come from premeditation. He seized her emotional collapse like a predator sensing weakness, cloaking his ambitions behind a proposal that, to any outsider, might appear to be an act of love, but was in truth a meticulously calculated power play. His plan, as cold as it was cunning, had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with vengeance. No one in Port Charles could grasp just how far Drew had fallen from the man he once was. Once a protector, now a manipulator, his soul had been corroded by humiliation and fury. The betrayal orchestrated by Nina and Jacinda had unmoored him, and the powerlessness he felt watching Michael win custody had driven him to the darkest corners of his psyche. Drew didn't want to build a future anymore, he wanted to dominate it, to take control of every variable, and to dismantle those who had humiliated him. Willow, fragile and grieving, was no longer his partner or his beacon of hope. She was the tool, the pawn, the perfectly positioned weapon he would turn against Nina, the woman who had once shared his bed but had now become the target of his most elaborate scheme. Inside the sterile, emotionless hospital room where Willow lay, the harsh fluorescent lights carved lines of weariness into her already gaunt face. The remnants of her recent losses haunted her posture, her voice, her every blink. She had become a ghost of herself, distant, hollow, and dazed. It was in that moment, when she could barely hold her head up, that Drew knelt beside her bed and offered her a future wrapped in velvet lies. His voice was soft, his eyes intense, but there was no warmth in them, only calculation. To Willow, caught in a storm of grief, the proposal seemed like a raft in dark waters. Somewhere in her heart, a maternal instinct longed for stability, for anything that resembled home. But beneath her exhaustion, she could feel it, something was wrong. The words were too smooth, too rehearsed. The touch of his hand too rehearsed, too cold. Her instincts, dulled by pain but not entirely extinguished, whispered of danger. Maxie had tried to warn her in vague, cautious ways, hints, glances, unfinished sentences. But Drew was too polished, too controlled. He spoke in riddles of redemption, of shared pain and healing, but what he was really doing was building a prison, brick by emotional brick, and luring her inside with promises he never intended to keep. Willow's eventual rejection of Drew's proposal should have been a moment of empowerment. Instead, it became the opening salvo in a psychological war she never saw coming. Drew didn't erupt. He didn't shout. He didn't slam doors or throw objects. Instead, he simply stopped smiling. His eyes darkened with a fury too silent to ignore, and a shadow fell over him that would never lift again. From that moment on, every gesture he made was part of a silent, methodical campaign to isolate Willow. He began planting seeds of doubt in her mind about Jason, subtly suggesting that her longtime protector had grown tired of her suffering. He painted Carly as judgmental, unsupportive, even manipulative. And Michael. Michael was recast as the enemy, the man who took her children and never looked back. The web Drew wove was nearly invisible, made of gaslighting, subtle manipulations, and reframed truths. He controlled her medications under the guise of concern, bringing her pills himself so that no one else could interfere. He hired a private psychiatrist with a shady past, someone who owed him favors and wouldn't hesitate to misdiagnose Willow if Drew pulled the strings. He spoke softly of rest, of recovery, of stepping away from the chaos to heal, but his real aim was to remove her from the equation completely. He suggested a specialized treatment center, far from Port Charles, far from anyone who might question his motives. It wasn't about killing her. It was about erasing her. She would still exist, yes, but in a controlled, sanitized version of life, stripped of influence, autonomy, and most crucially, stripped of her mother, Nina. Drew wanted Nina to suffer as he had. He wanted her to lose her daughter not in death, but in a slow, bureaucratic erasure from her life, to watch from the outside as Willow slipped further away under the care of a man Nina once trusted. Drew's obsession wasn't loud, but it was consuming. He checked surveillance at the hospital, tracked Willow's phone, intercepted messages. When Jason tried to visit, Drew arranged last-minute therapy sessions or medical tests to delay him. When Carly called, her messages were never passed along. Willow, already vulnerable, began to question her own mind. She was told she was paranoid. She began to believe she was unstable, incapable of parenting. And as her world narrowed, Drew presented himself as the only constant. The only person who hadn't abandoned her. The only one who could still save her. It was gaslighting at its most sophisticated, a manipulation so refined it almost worked. Almost. Because what Drew hadn't counted on was that even in the depths of her despair, a mother's love could still ignite a spark of resistance. When he denied her a supervised visit with Amelia, something inside Willow fractured in the opposite direction. For the first time in weeks, she screamed, not in fear, but in defiance. She threw the pills across the room, demanded her charts, and locked herself in the hospital bathroom until the real staff arrived. A nurse overheard enough to raise an alarm. A technician noticed inconsistencies in the prescriptions. Carly, alerted by an anonymous tip, possibly from Maxie, forced her way into the room and found Willow disoriented but lucid enough to say one word, help. The unraveling came swiftly after that. Jason returned with a lawyer. Drew tried to play the misunderstood fiancé, but his lies couldn't withstand scrutiny. Medical records were subpoenaed. His payments traced. The psychiatrist disappeared. Willow's statements, backed by multiple witnesses, painted a harrowing portrait of psychological coercion. Drew was arrested not with handcuffs, but with the weight of his own failure bearing down on him. As he was led out of General Hospital, he locked eyes with Nina, not with regret, but with seething hatred. He had failed to destroy her through her daughter. But he had come close. Willow, broken but not beaten, began a long road back to herself. The trauma was deep, the healing slow, but in the quiet moments of recovery, she reclaimed her voice. Her bond with Nina, once frayed by secrets and history, began to mend. Carly and Jason remained protective but no longer smothering. And Drew, once her savior, would be remembered not as a fallen hero, but as a cautionary tale of how quickly grief, betrayal, and ambition can twist a man beyond recognition. In Port Charles, forgiveness might come eventually, but forgetting never does. Nina, for all her flaws and the countless mistakes that had marred her relationship with her daughter, had always possessed one undeniable gift, intuition. And that gift, once again, began whispering to her that something was deeply wrong. She couldn't explain it with facts, nor could she substantiate it with hard evidence, but every fiber of her being warned her that Drew's concern for Willow was not what it appeared to be. On the surface, Drew was flawless. Gracious in his tone, courteous in public, never raising his voice, always arriving at the hospital with flowers, or coordinating treatment plans with an unsettling level of efficiency. To the untrained eye, he looked like the devoted partner trying to support a heartbroken woman through the wreckage of her lost custody battle. But Nina saw past the veneer, saw the way his smile didn't reach his eyes, how his words always seemed carefully rehearsed, and how everyone around him seemed subtly pushed away. She tried to call Willow. Every attempt rang once and went to voicemail, then nothing. She left messages, but they were never returned. Emails bounced back. Gifts she sent, handwritten letters, framed photos of Willow and the kids, even a simple silk scarf from Paris, were returned unopened. It didn't feel like a rejection from her daughter, it felt like interception. Nina reached out to Carly, swallowing her pride and asking for help. Carly, usually guarded, admitted something didn't feel right either, but she lacked proof. Jason, too, had a creeping suspicion, but Drew's web of control was nearly impenetrable. Each time anyone questioned him, he responded with practiced humility, offering hollow reassurances and convincing explanations. He was untouchable, not by virtue of charisma alone, but because he had meticulously engineered a narrative of benevolence that silenced even the most intuitive minds. Behind the sterile walls of the hospital, however, darkness was metastasizing. Drew had quietly arranged for Willow's medical records to be altered, her prescriptions increased without justification, her evaluations skewed to reflect deeper instability than actually existed. A psychiatrist known for questionable ethics was brought in under the guise of specialized trauma therapy. Nurses who once chatted with Willow casually were reassigned, replaced by staff who kept their distance and followed strict instructions: never leave her alone with visitors, never allow unsupervised calls, always report any signs of resistance directly to Drew. Willow, meanwhile, began to unravel in silence. The grief of losing her children was compounded by isolation, sedation, and psychological manipulation. Her sense of time warped. She began referring to Amelia as Wiley, reliving moments that no longer existed. Some days she refused food. Other days she wouldn't leave her bed. Her eyes lost clarity. Her hands trembled with confusion, and her voice, once filled with maternal fire, was reduced to whispers of memories and incoherent pleas. In a fleeting moment of lucidity, Willow reached for her phone and tried to text Jason, her last thread of trust. But her fingers, weak and trembling, betrayed her. The message was never sent. The phone was later found under her pillow and confiscated. Drew, watching from the shadows, believed he had finally subdued her, broken her spirit enough to mold her into the silent, docile figure he needed her to be, an emotionally vacant shell to showcase in front of Nina, as punishment for every scar she had etched into his past. For a time, it seemed Drew had succeeded. But he had underestimated one thing: the ferocity of a mother's love, and the instinctive resistance that rises from the soul when a parent is denied their child. When Drew informed Willow that she would not be allowed to visit Amelia, not now, not ever, something inside her cracked open. The sedation, the manipulation, the psychological fog, it all burned away in an instant. Her cries shattered the stillness of the ward, a raw and visceral sound that sent tremors down the hall. She refused her medications, flung a tray of food at the wall, screamed through the night, and demanded to see Carly. No longer passive, she tore through the veil Drew had placed around her. A nurse, rushing in to restrain her, froze when she witnessed Drew grab Willow's wrist, too tightly, too violently, and his words meant to silence her. The nurse, a new hire with no ties to Drew's manipulation ring, did not look away. She filed an incident report. And that single act, one small stand in the face of silent tyranny, set everything into motion. Carly was contacted and stormed into the hospital, flanked by Jason and a lawyer from Diane's firm. They found Willow curled in the corner of her hospital bed, clutching the photo of Amelia like a lifeline, her eyes wide with terror but finally clear. When asked what had happened, she didn't scream, she didn't cry, she spoke. Slowly, quietly, but with unwavering certainty, she revealed everything. Every manipulation, every change in her medication, every lie Drew told, and every moment of fear she had endured. The room grew cold with the weight of her testimony. A hospital board was convened that same afternoon. Willow, though physically frail, faced the panel with quiet defiance, and her words painted a chilling picture of systematic psychological abuse. Evidence soon followed. Logs of altered prescriptions. Surveillance footage revealing Drew's controlling behavior. Anonymous statements from staff members who had seen too much and could no longer stay silent. Drew's connection to Jacinda was uncovered, a series of messages, financial transfers, and a private investigator's report confirmed that their relationship had never truly ended, and that she had helped orchestrate the very scandal that ruined Willow's custody chances. It was all laid bare. And for the first time, the mask Drew wore began to crack. He was arrested in silence, no handcuffs needed, only the suffocating reality that his game had been exposed. But as he was led away, he locked eyes with Nina one last time. The hatred in his gaze didn't waver, didn't falter. To him, this wasn't defeat, it was simply a delay. A seed of vengeance had been planted long ago, and even now, he believed that it would grow. But for Nina, there was only one priority, her daughter. She rushed to Willow's side, unsure if she would be welcomed or shunned. To her relief, Willow did not turn away. Their embrace was tentative at first, then fierce. Words would come later. For now, they had each other, and the long road of healing could begin. The scars Drew left would not fade easily, and the damage he inflicted would take years to fully process. But the chain had been broken. The illusion had collapsed. And in its place stood a fragile, raw, but real connection, between mother and daughter, between truth and survival. Port Charles had witnessed many storms. But this one left behind a new kind of reckoning, one that whispered of resilience, of buried strength rising again, and of darkness that, though potent, could never truly extinguish the light. Drew was arrested without resistance, but the silence in the room was more suffocating than any outburst could have been. He said nothing, offered no plea, no justification, no apology. But his eyes betrayed everything. They were cold, unflinching, and seething with a hatred that had fermented far beyond the boundaries of heartbreak or humiliation. He didn't look at Willow with the haunted gaze of a man who had lost the woman he loved. No, he looked at her as a failed conquest, an object he could no longer bend, a variable he could no longer control. In that final glance, there was no trace of affection, no regret, only contempt and the bitter residue of a plan unraveled too soon. As the steel bars of the holding cell clanged shut behind him, Drew sat in eerie stillness, his shoulders squared not in defeat, but in quiet defiance. He mumbled a single name over and over under his breath, like a broken mantra, a curse he couldn't release, Nina. It was as though his mind had shifted blame entirely, as if every step down this dark path had not been his own making, but a reaction to the wound Nina had carved into his life. The look in his eyes said it all. He didn't believe his story had ended. He didn't see the cell as a conclusion but as a pause, a moment to regroup, to seethe in silence while the next chapter took root in his mind. In Drew's warped perception, the punishment wasn't his to bear. It was hers. And one day, he intended for her to feel it. Meanwhile, Willow, physically free but emotionally imprisoned, began the slow, agonizing journey of recovery. She was no longer in Drew's control, but the aftermath of his psychological warfare clung to her like a second skin. Her sense of self had been fractured. The betrayal cut deeper than any legal loss, for it came from someone she had once clung to for protection. She hadn't just lost her children, she had lost the image of a man she thought would never harm her. Every memory of Drew that once offered comfort had turned toxic, rewritten by the horrifying realization that his affection had been a facade, his gestures weapons cloaked in tenderness. Willow found herself flinching at gentle touches, second-guessing kindness, and fearing the motives of even those closest to her. But somewhere beneath the layers of grief and confusion, the embers of resilience flickered. She had survived. And in that survival, a seed of transformation began to bloom. The woman who had once collapsed under the weight of loss was slowly, almost imperceptibly, learning to stand again. Not as the dependent figure others had seen, but as someone forging a strength born from pain. Her steps were small, her voice still trembled, but her will, her determination to reclaim her life, was growing louder by the day. Nina, too, stood at a crossroads. She was not blameless, and she knew it. Her history with Willow had been poisoned long before Drew's manipulation, tarnished by secrets, half-truths, and the corrosive weight of pride. But now, the doors that had once been shut between them were slightly ajar. She had seen the devastation firsthand, had watched her daughter unravel and come back from the edge. There was a chance now, not for absolution, perhaps, but for understanding, for slow reconciliation. Nina, shaken to her core by the damage Drew had wrought, resolved to do better. She would no longer push, no longer try to control. She would wait, stand in the light, and be ready when Willow reached out. Because if she had learned anything, it was that love without honesty is no love at all. Jason, ever the quiet sentinel, remained unwavering. Through the chaos, the betrayal, and the heartbreak, he had stayed. When everyone else had been shut out, when even Carly hesitated, he had kept watch. Not with demands, not with expectations, but with loyalty so deep it required no explanation. He saw Willow's fragility and guarded it without encroaching on her space. He offered support without smothering, strength without pressure. He was the one figure in her orbit who had not tried to fix her, but simply allowed her to exist, broken pieces and all. It was this steadiness that might one day help Willow fully return to herself. In Jason's presence, she didn't feel judged. She felt safe. But the calm in Port Charles was deceptive. What Drew had done was not the action of a lone madman but part of a deeper rot that had gone unnoticed. There were whispers in hospital corridors, about doctors with ties to Jacinda, about files still missing, about new board members recently installed at General Hospital under suspicious circumstances. Not everyone involved had been caught. Not every piece had fallen into place. There were others, perhaps, watching and waiting, studying the fallout of Drew's downfall and learning from his mistakes. And Drew, sitting in his cell, his mind coiled like a viper, was not finished. He was merely silenced, not defeated. There were calls being made from disposable phones, letters smuggled out through the hands of sympathetic visitors, and names being passed like currency among those who trafficked in secrets. He had laid foundations that might yet rise again. And if not through his own hands, then through those of someone equally corrupted. For Willow, the road ahead was uncertain. The courtroom battles were not over. She still faced the arduous task of rebuilding her case for custody, regaining the trust of the system, and reclaiming her place in her children's lives. Her mental health remained fragile, and the threat of relapse lingered like a ghost in the corners of her mind. Every morning was a battle against the residue Drew left behind. But she rose.